Hi everyone. Oh my god, so many people in real life, it's so lovely. Thanks very much for joining us this evening. We are here because it marks 1 year of us running the Reset Go programme, but also to tackle this tricky problem of architecture's diversity problem. So that I'm going to leave to really be covered by the panel, and we'll get to that really quickly. But what I wanted to do is, because it's sort of founded in this year of the Reset Go programme, is just to give a little bit of an overview of what we've been doing so that there's like an understanding of what that is, and as a bit of context for the panel discussion later. But I'll try and keep that pretty quick. So my name's Holly, I'm from We Made That, and we, along with other London Practice Forum practices, have been running Reset Go for a year now. So let me give you a bit of an overview. Reset Go is an accessible, hands-on, paid work experience and mentoring programme established with the mission of diversifying architecture practices. Maybe you know that already because you're here. And then this is quite a lot of text, so don't worry too much. And hopefully, if you're in this room, you know why this is an important thing to be trying to tackle. Because only 37% of architect jobs in London are held by women. 7% of all registered architects are from black and minority ethnic backgrounds, or black, Asian and multi-ethnic backgrounds, I should say, for the full mouthful. And that 90% of jobs within the creative industries are from people from kind of more privileged socioeconomic backgrounds, so this is also an issue for us. And so with that context, we put together a bid, which we put forward to a programme called Stride, for a bit of funding to support this. And through this programme, which I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about now, we were targeting 150 individuals to benefit from this programme about tackling diversity in architecture and the built environment. The way that we've done that is working alongside the London Practice Forum. So that's a group of 25 practices in London, of which Russell, who's on the panel later, could tell you a bit more. But that's it, kind of like-minded practices from London. And we've also been working with Afterparty as our critical friends. So they've been watching us as we go, advising us, telling us how to do things better, and also contributing a report, a sort of evaluation report really, of how things have been, whether we've been doing well enough or not, suggestions for how we might take things forward. So we just want to take the opportunity to say thanks so much. Thanks to all of the participating practices from the London Practice Forum. Thanks to Afterparty for your help and advice and criticism. I think it's fair, but it has been really great. And thanks to Stride as well for supporting the programme. So Afterparty, I mentioned that they've done this evaluation report, but they also fed into all of the strands of work that we were doing with a particular focus on the paid work placements, of which we also have Randy, who's partook in that programme, so he'll be able to talk to you about that, which included things like how we brief people, how we have a kind of shared understanding of what needs to be achieved through that programme, the sort of idea of cohorts of people being able to connect with each other as well, so not just the fact of being placed into an architecture practice, and have helped us to shape that. And this is what we've been delivering through Reset Go, so paid placements, workshops, knowledge exchange events like tonight, and mentoring on a kind of more one-to-one basis. So across the whole programme we had six week placements and 24 one-week placements. That's actually a bit over what we said that we would do, but we couldn't turn anyone away. So we shuffled the budget around to make sure that we could accommodate that. And as I mentioned, we've also had this sort of idea of cohorts, so trying to run the placements all together so that there's groups of people that are all benefiting from the same programme and able to connect with each other, as well as with the individual practices that they've been placed with. We've had 3 half-day workshops with 12 attendees, so that's been kind of partnerships between more diverse practices and I guess the London Practice Forum practices. And 18 people attended a full-day zine-making workshop with Afterparty, which produced this amazing zine that we have in the office called Cancel Corpse, which is quite something to behold, and doing that with Page Masters. And then one-to-one mentoring has been CV surgery, so there's 21 of those, 34 kind of one-to-one sessions beyond CV surgeries, and then 2 of those have led to onwards kind of permanent jobs with London Practice Forum practices. So, tot it all up over 1 year, and what I didn't say actually at the beginning is that the Stride programme was just across 4 London boroughs, so Lambeth, Lewisham, Southwark, Wandsworth. So together with the participating London Practice Forum practices, we've delivered 131 outcomes. It's like a mentoring session, a placement, just in those 4 boroughs. And you can see the stats there about our female or non-binary participants and black, Asian and multi-ethnic participants. So for us this is really significant, and we think that, I mean, we definitely couldn't have done it without that bigger kind of practice forum, but it feels meaningful to have done something about it, something more active, and we were really aware that as employers, this is what we can do, but we can do more than just what we can achieve as individual practices if we work together. And I suppose that's the point of tonight. We're very pleased to have won a Diversity in Action Award from Thornton Education Trust and shortlisted for the Activism Award at Archibald. And then this is really a prompt. We don't have a set answer for this yet, but we think that we've established proof of concept of demand. So there's been, like I say, oversubscription for the work placements in particular. So we had about £45,000 of funding from Stride. We matched that with all of the support that the London Practice Forum practices were able to offer. We've been kind of reflecting on ourselves, like how it's been going, how we could do things better next time, and what we can do more to continue to support diversification of architecture and architecture practices. So, I mean, in summary, we want to be bigger, better, and more impactful. We think we can do more boroughs. We did 131 things for 131 people just in 4 boroughs. We can see that there's potential for that to be located or kind of related to particular locations of change. And we're really interested in this thing where people ended up being employed in those practices. So not only for the kind of improved diversity within the individual practices, but obviously for those individuals. So thinking about more specific kind of permanent employment tracks or apprenticeship tracks would be really interesting to think about more. And we're interested to collaborate with a wider set of employer partners, because obviously it's only 25 practices so far. And we know that there's interest for that, so we've had over 30 practices beyond the LPF say to us that they're interested. 3 universities have said they're interested, and also a whole bunch of practices and practitioners beyond just architecture. So we know that this isn't an issue just for architects and for architecture, but for engineers, for kind of property consultants, and QSs. I don't know how diverse the QSs are that you work with. So all of that kind of wider, broader spectrum of the built environment, I think, could benefit from a programme like this. We are thinking right now about what the future of this programme could be. The funding is kind of done for this round. So we're really, really interested in thinking about how we can support it. So this is just really a call that if you or your organisation are interested in being involved, particularly in the sort of provider side, although we're interested to hear from you if you'd like to participate as well, but particularly if you think there's something that you can do through your organisations to help the programme or the next sort of iteration of the programme, we would love to hear from you. So here's the email address, resetgo@wemadethat.co.uk. But I think we're much more interested to hear from the panel, so I'm going to shut up. But just so that you know, that's what we've been doing. That's kind of the prompt for us being here tonight. And with that, I will hand over to Nisha Kurian, Associate at We Made That.
Thanks, Holly. Andy, you and I are sharing a mic. So thank you for that introduction and a kind of roundup of the year, the pilot year for ResetGo. And what we wanted to do with this panel is we wanted to be able to kind of capture some of those things that we've learned through that pilot year, but also kind of look beyond, look at that wider issue and really sort of turn the spotlight on this issue of the lack of diversity in architecture and how we can, collectively tackle this from these various perspectives. So the way that we have structured the panel is to be able to understand from various perspectives, like how we can answer this question, that is, how do we kind of create meaningful change in our sector, which we know has its issues, and the issues that Holly has highlighted here and that ResetGo as a program is trying to address. So what I'm going to try and do is set this question as a challenge to our panelists, and our panelists are offering sort of these 4 different perspectives in and around the sector, the architecture sector. So we have from the participant, who is somebody who was part of the program. We have the public servant, somebody coming at it from the kind of public sector perspective, the educator, and you're in the wrong order, but that's absolutely fine, I can deal with it, and the practice boss, which is Russell. So I'm going to introduce everybody individually. So firstly, myself, I'm Nisha Kurian, as Holly said. I'm an associate at We Made That. I'm an architect and I'm an urbanist, and I've been a co-leader of this program through its kind of pilot year. And so our first participant is Randy. Randy is a British Ghanaian architecture graduate. I'm going to be reading a little bit your bio.
That's cool.
I didn't memorize them, whose interest lies in experiential interventions in existing spaces in various functions and contexts. He completed his ResetGo architectural placement with the RDH architects, and he's also initiated Hit You on the Rebound, which he's described as an experiment in aiming to create, consult, and curate meaningful experiences. We hope Randy will fill us in a bit more about this because it sounds great. And next we have the educator, and that's Neil Pinder over here. So Neil Pinder is an activist and educator at the heart and mind of the Homegrown Plus operation. He's taught at a number of schools over 25 years and is currently head of product design at Graveney School in South London, where he's introduced architecture into their curriculum. He's inspired many pupils to take an interest in design subjects and received recognition for his work doing so, including the prestigious Open House Teacher of the Year Award, and very recently, congratulations Neil, you've been awarded an honorary fellowship with the RIBA for recognition of your kind of impact in the architecture sector, as someone kind of on the outside of it, but advocating for more people to kind of diverse backgrounds to get into it. And then third, we have the public servant. So Zara Haider is a regeneration and development architect at London Borough of Enfield, and also an alumni of public practice. And in these roles, she has produced and published a case study with recommendations for improving fairness and diversity of design teams through alternative models of procurement, which we'd like you to talk about a bit more, which sounds amazing. And Zara is also the founder of a non-profit mentoring organization called Our Girls, which works with young students from marginalized backgrounds to encourage diversity in various professions. And last but not least is Russell Curtis. Russell is the founding director of RCKA, a London-based architecture practice that specializes in innovative residential, community, and commercial projects. Russell is also the founding member of Project Compass CIC, a not-for-profit research organization that campaigns for better procurement of public buildings, and is the founder of the London Practice Forum, so has been heavily involved in the program so far. So thank you all for kind of joining us. So to kick things off, what we're going to do is a bit of scene setting. So what we're trying to understand is, try and identify through our own experience, like what are those barriers that are being faced by people from various groups that leads to this lack of diversity in our sector. And I want to hear about kind of your own first-hand experience of this. And I'm going to start with you, Randy, because you're the closest to me. But essentially, can you tell us a bit about your kind of journey into architecture, and what do you consider some of those kind of barriers that potentially young people of kind of minority backgrounds are facing in terms of education and employment?
Cool. So I decided to study architecture quite late. I think I was about 15 or 16 when I decided to study architecture, and it was quite an interesting journey. I fell upon architecture because it's kind of like I didn't have no relatives or architects, nor really directly met an architect. So it was kind of sounded cool, but kind of like a mystery career. And sort of as I started to realise what my interests were, I think it was a career counsellor sort of advised, oh, you study architecture. And my interest sort of spurred from there, making me decide to study at university, where I think at first it was quite surprising how many people knew about architecture so much more thoroughly than me. Then I had a couple of architects I liked, but when people had really thorough understandings of architecture, where to me it was still this mystery subject. So I guess that was my experience, sort of realising very quickly that what seemed like a mystery to me was a reality to people very, very early, that you're speaking to people in first year and they say, oh, I did a practice experience when I was 14, you kind of like, I just worked at the local JD. Potato. So I guess that was very, very apparent from early on. Sort of had that awkward thing of sort of in education being unsure if your perspective is even valid, because I guess you don't know the traditions as early on as other people do. And you are playing a bit catch up, but you do sort of have to do what you have to do and sort of educate yourself quite quickly. The next question was in terms of barriers faced. I'd say the biggest barrier faced is, I guess, the overarching theme of unconscious bias, that soon as I guess you got to speak or even try and justify something or something even from your lived experience, there is always the unconscious bias that sometimes people, it's not, your words not have as much weight, nor as your lived experiences. And I think even the term unconscious bias is a bit an ironic term because you're very conscious of it when it's done to you. Does that make sense? So I think unconscious bias is the biggest thing because you are consciously sort of knowing that you are being judged, and then that leads to, I guess, confidence issues where you're sort of thinking, is architecture for me? Should I do something else? And I guess sort of, while I personally not experienced it, a lot of people around me from the same background as me have experienced where you finish uni and you don't get a placement in the first 6 months and you haven't got the financial background to be able to stay out of practice for longer. Like, you need to have a financial income. So a lot of people tend to move on to other things due to that barrier of, well, I don't have any existing network in architecture. I haven't managed to gain the experience, and now you're sort of at that roundabout of what do you do, and am I qualified enough to sort of stay within the profession? So a lot of people end up going to, I guess, a bit more volatile and flexible sort of creative industries where the entry point is way lower and way more visible.
So you were saying things like graphic design, for example?
Yeah. So it's like with graphic design, I guess because it's not as investment heavy, anyone could initiate a project themselves that you can create a live portfolio from your bedroom if you want to. And I guess because that ease of accessibility, even though active practitioners are way more diverse compared to architecture, where a young architect is someone who's age 60, so the change isn't going to occur as fast, both from a visual standpoint and also from a opportunity and accessibility standpoint. So I think it's very intriguing to me how many people study architecture. When you speak to them now, so what do you do? I do tech, I do graphic, and I think I'd say there's more people who graduate in architecture from a BAME background and end up in different backgrounds now, different professions, than there is sort of seeing all the way through. And a lot of the time it's not a choice.
Well, I'm interested in your kind of question about, coming into this new world without a network, without that knowledge of it. And Neil, this is a little bit what you're doing, is kind of creating that pathway into it with your students who might not necessarily know, how to access that sector as a career. And part of what you're doing is creating this network of people who, are like the students who might go into this, to know that, you're not a complete outsider. I wonder if you want to speak a bit about that with Homegrown Plus.
First of all, thank you for inviting me here. And yes, I'm a totally imposter in the situation because I went to art school. I grew up on a council estate, went to Camberwell Art School, and I was a club promoter. I've been a DJ, and then I love art, and I carried on doing my art. And then I found that a lot of young students who were talented couldn't actually access the programs that they wanted to access. So be they creative programs, or be they architectural programs, or digital programs, just because they weren't given the right, as you were saying, tools to orientate themselves around the society which has been socially engineered against them. So as from educational side of things, we have to realise that there's a two-tier system that we have going on, and the two-tier system is the fact that the private schools can do what they want and they can say what they want, and then their students come out with the talent, not necessarily the talent, but the confidence to look like they've got the talent to orientate themselves around the part of society which they have claimed sort of knowledge to through their parents, etc. So when you become a DJ, you learn to read a crowd quite easily, and reading a crowd of architecture is quite an elite crowd in itself, because it professes to, we can help you, we can do this for you, we can give you a work experience for your kids for 3 days, etc., while their kids and their kids' friends get a week or a month in the architectural practice. And then after that, the kids that you have, the kids that I have, we have to teach them a language, and the language is basically middle class English, because it's a different language altogether to the language I'm talking now. So when I'm in front of my class, I'm fortunate to teach in a school which is quite a high achieving school, and a lot of the head teacher in there, he wanted the students, the teachers, to be like Russell Group sort of graduates, etc., etc. So the kids who are high achievers or achievers in the school, no matter what colour they are, they tend to orientate themselves around this language that everybody can understand, which people like myself, when we was younger, we couldn't understand. So what I do is, when I see talent, so I can see talent, or say for example, I've got a guy now who's at Kingston University, he's in his 3rd year. When he's in year 7, I looked at his drawings, and he comes from, his parents I think are Asian, Malaysian, and I looked at his drawings just by teaching him technology, and I said, you're going to be an architect. I said, and all I say to them is, stick with me and you'll go far. And literally, and his drawings were superb, and now he's just finishing off at Kingston University. Yeah. And it's the same thing with, if you see talent, just talent, raw talent, you can't hide it. But the system is designed that the people who are in power, and it's about power, control and money. It's not necessarily about ethnicity, religion, race, creed. It's about the people who are in power, about them keeping this power. And the only way they can keep this power is to pass the baton on to somebody who looks like them. That's why the statistics that you were given are so sort of realistic. And and then you have the power. Once you've got the power, you've got the control. And once you've got the control, you keep the money. So what's happening now is we've got a situation with a government who's quite right of centre, and that's putting it mildly, you know, is where students it's ladled with a 100 grand debt, you know, and you say to somebody, but you can make it as an architect, and they're looking at 100 grand debt. When I come out, I may earn 24 grand in the 1st year or whatever. How is that sustainable? Well, it's sustainable because they're helped by their extended family, which people like myself couldn't help. So this is why I've grown this network, and we talk about parallel working collaborations. And it was so brilliant tonight because I was talking to 2 guys who I respect so much. One is a guy who basically hid from me for 2 years, Larry over there. Right? And there's another guy, a young guy called Daniel, who is up and coming. He's going to be a superstar one day. I know it. And we have to form these collaborations. Don't matter who they are, creed, colour, race, religion. And this is why Homegrown Plus is the homegrown architects are all the kids who were my alumni in school. So people like Joseph Henry, Mark Warren, and people like these, they've been my alumni. They're the kids I taught. Expose my age, sorry about this, you know, about 15, you know. And then the pluses are all the ones they bring to me. And then we connect to the university. So we work on parallel working systems and parallel working collaborations. And we don't threaten the main system, we connect to them. And so Homegrown Plus is connected to over 30 different architectural practices, universities. We're connected outside of England to Ghana, Nigeria, the Caribbean, South America, Europe, and we're feeding all back into these different diasporas, because from these diasporas come all the different people who look like them, talk like them, and they understand how they are. So you have people like Pedro Gil, who's Colombian, who's absolutely amazing. So he feeds into the South American. You know, we have people like Elsie Owusu, who comes from Ghana, Leslie Loco, who comes from Ghana, and they've set up a African sort of council, Future Education, I think it's called, in Ghana. So we're connecting to all of these people, but feeding back into people who look like them and giving them confidence in what they classified as their home countries.
Yeah. I want to go back for a second to that point that you made about having to kind of learn a language when you go into this kind of new workforce, into this new world. Zara, I'm kind of throwing this to you because Zara, you were in practice in the private sector and now are working in the public sector, still working in a kind of built environment as an architect within a council. But I wonder, like, are you able to expand on your experience of, having come into that world and having to learn a specific language, and whether there's something that the public sector or the private sector could learn from what's working maybe or not working in the public sector and vice versa, in order to, try and firstly attract more people of diverse backgrounds, but also, quite importantly, retain them?
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting question, because I've actually been thinking about that a fair bit recently in terms of what a lot of the people I work with in the public sector, I was instantly surprised by the range of people there are in terms of, age, background, life experiences, actually abilities. So we have people who may come from different disability backgrounds as well. And they've been there sort of 30 years plus, and they've got a huge amount of embedded knowledge. They're experts. A lot of them hold, a great deal of love actually for the borough itself. And actually, I think one of the things, and it sounds really small, but I think it touches on both what you, Randy, and Neil were talking about, is I think what the public sector does right is things like salaries over time, support, flexibility. So if you are a caregiver, I mean, I'm now on maternity leave. My son was born extremely early, and they've offered me preterm leave, which makes a huge difference, and that's such a huge incentive to something that I would have never thought about, I think, as a student. But these are the things that make you want to stay and actually make it really easy to stay there for a long time. So if you've got different responsibilities or if you've got different needs, it's designed to cater for those things, and it's very much, there's no judgment, there's no kind of issue over it. And I think things like overtime is literally minute for minute, and as we start to get older, if we have a different range of needs, whether even as a young person with caregiving needs, that can make a huge difference. And I think in the pandemic that was particularly amplified. I remember hearing anecdotally people saying within practice feeling like your background has to be really curated to show interesting things, whereas actually most of us live in homes that are potentially quite messy and actually might have young kids or like family members running or screaming in the background. And suddenly inviting that into a screen, feeling quite judged, it's like, I mean, it was just not there at all. It was completely fine for you to have your washing machine and your children as part of the Teams call. There was no judgment because we actually carried on being professional about it. And that's not me making a statement about public versus private. I think I just felt a very different environment in terms of being comfortable about bringing more of myself out, which I've never felt in architecture, actually. I've just never really felt like there's any room for anything other than kind of the job, which is more, it can feel more like a vocation, even though it's not, it is a job. And so I think that's like, it sounds really small, but actually I think it's a big part of it in terms of like the work culture, in terms of feeling like you're being valued because you're offering something, feeling like you're being paid for your time. These things, where sometimes I felt like when we talk about it in architecture, it can feel like you're selling out if you're trying to talk about being fairly paid. But I mean, it's ridiculous. Actually, this is one of the only professions where the public sector pays significantly better than the private. That's actually insane. Like, people sell out to go to the private sector, but here it's actually, you would do better.
Or it's maybe something that you just don't talk about because you know it's bad, and it's like a taboo subject almost. I wonder, like, I mean, I'm going to throw this to you now, Russell. Like, as the practice boss, you're kind of billed as this, the person on the inside, kind of, you have that influence within the sector. And what can architecture practices, do to address this kind of very valid point about the sometimes working culture and, the hours and the difficulty in being more flexible with your time that accommodates other needs like childcare and then salary? Quite clearly.
Well, I think, as lockdown's shown us, we can manage it, can't we? I mean, we've had to adapt to new ways new ways of working, and the messiness, as you said, of real life, and you know, we've at our practice as adopters, many others have adopted completely new contracts where we do require people to be in the office a certain amount of time a week, but then there's flexibility in that, but also people can work from home 2 days a week. So we're already adapting. But as far as what practices can do, I mean, you know, we operate in a very strange market because we've got to be profitable. We've got to be profitable in order to pay ourselves, pay the rent, pay the staff, keep everybody happy and fulfilled, and all those things. Yet we you know, I don't want this discussion to be about fees, but inevitably we are competing in a very distorted market where and I do think, and it's partly with my procurement hat on, I do think the public sector has a role to play in this, because it quite often speaks about all of the good things that we need to do, sustainability and diversity and social value. Yet on the other hand, quite often, if you do a lot of work for the public sector, as we do, as that does, you know, we're quite often being scored down very heavily because our fees are higher, because we're trying to do all these things. And even practices like us, which you know, do our best to address lots of these issues, particularly around diversity and representation, it can prove very, very difficult, because we also have to be winning work and competing with others who maybe don't have the same standards as we try and live by. So it's not easy. It's not easy.
I mean, I'd like to go back to that point about what the public sector could do in terms of procurement, and actually back to you, Zara, because I know you've been involved in those processes to an extent, thinking about how, I mean, you were framing it from the point of being able to bid for a project in a commercially viable way. But the other thing that happens sometimes with public sector procurement, such as we've seen with the kind of Southwark framework, is again reinforcing that lack of diversity, and you end up with the same kind of practices and teams who are then shaping communities like residential neighbourhoods that with nobody in them that looks like them.
I can talk to that for a little bit. I mean, you're absolutely right, and I think we, you know, there are clearly unconscious, perhaps, but bias, prejudice built into these systems, because you know, I think everybody recognised that the infamous Southwark framework was not done well, and Southwark is something like 40% not people from non-white background. Yet the framework had no practices led by people of colour on it whatsoever. Firstly, in the first iteration of it. But I think, and this may be a controversial view, but I think we need to move away from simply appointing on the basis of diversity and asking questions. Because what the public sector procurement is not very good at is asking questions that will enable practices, more diverse practices, to be appointed. Because what happens is they'll say, for example, well, you know, as part of your team you must have a practice led by a person of colour, let's say. But not why. Why is that? We all know it's important. We all know why we should be doing it. But because it's morally the right thing to do. But there has to be more justification. We have to be asking the question. I mean, I'm not from a particularly privileged background. I went to a state school, and the biggest barrier I faced, I suppose, in the profession is I fucked my A levels up. You know, but in a way, you know, and again, this was some time ago, so I'm older, so these guys. But we do need to start thinking about how we can promote practices from, you know, who are working in these communities. What questions do we need to be asking? Because I can design housing, but I'm not from a multi-generational family. I'm not from an extended family. I'm not from a Muslim family. You know, I don't have those life experiences, and the procurement system should be asking those questions, rather than just simply saying, well, we need people from a diverse background, but not why we need to do that.
Yeah, go on, Neil.
Well, basically, I think it's not unconscious. I think it's a conscious situation where people make these decisions. Because when practices come to me, I look at their website, and now I'm actually breaking down the people of ethnicity in their website. And you know, some practices, just for sheer tick box exercise, they'd have a person of colour or a person of a diversity in there. But if you actually break it down, you know, a practice with X number of about just under 150 would have 0.8% person of colour in there. And you think to yourself, the person of colour happens to be the IT person. I'm looking at architecture, right? I'm looking at architecture. And then you'd have another person, a couple of people, say 3% males of colour, and they would be the office manager or something like this. And then you'd have your part 1s and part 2s. Now, you know, they've ticked a box because they know the part 1s and part 2s are not going to be there that long. So what you're doing is you're manipulating a system for the way you want to portray the information. And whether you come out with stats all the time, stats can be manipulated to whatever you want them to be. If you're really after diverse architectural situation, and may I add that it's a travesty that Marsha Ranroop, who is the first person of diversity for Reba, has actually resigned, you know, within the last X number of days. And so you say to yourself, you know, scratch whatever hair I've got on my head. And I say to myself, look, they appointed a person of colour because they really wanted to, you know, tick that box of Black Lives Matter, you know, inclusion, etc., etc. But within a year, she's gone. So who's going to take that place? Who's going to take that mantle? She was doing an absolutely amazing job from my perspective. And so you say to yourself, you know, do you really want it? And I lecture on different and talk on different platforms and say, this is the pushback. This is the push. There is a pushback where certain peoples in their communities, they're sitting back and saying, look, we've had enough of this. We just want it to go back to normal. And their normal is control. And let's be under no illusion. But the rest of people who really want it, like the people in this room and the people from various practices who are in this room who really want it, they're the people have to go out and stand up and be counted. Because if you stand up and be counted, you know, you have a voice. If you sit back and just, you know, say yes, 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 and then go to your nice dinner party, you know, and everything's hunky-dory, and then suddenly people are saying X, Y, Z, you know, we're not going to get anywhere, you know. And as I said to you, I could quote you statistics after statistics about the how many £billion of creative industry is worth in London alone pre-pandemic, how much it's worth England-wide pre-pandemic, and then after, see how many companies get that from diverse backgrounds. You know, to be a SME, maximum 250. I don't know a diverse practice of 250 people. I know micro ones, you know, but I don't know an SME of 200. I mean, maybe somebody can enlighten me. Please tell me, do you know any diverse practices of 250 people?
Are we talking about the ownership here? Or are we talking about the diversity within the employees? What?
How do you mean the ownership?
Well, I mean, you know, I have a practice of 20 odd people, but and there are 3 directors and we're all white. And we have all the shares between us. So you know that's the. I get the sense that that's the issue.
I'm not hitting on you here, but
no,
absolutely, you
that's
just made the statistic, which is the norm. And then if you escalate that upwards from 50 to 60 to 70, right. That happens to be the norm. I mean, there's only a couple of actual, and somebody told me about another one, but there's only I've been looking at. There's only one guy that I know in a practice who is at a senior level who looks like me right now.
Yeah, I agree.
And the rest of them, They don't look like me.
But I think there's two issues here that we need to address, because and the Southwark framework and other, like, you know, the focus of that was we need to be appointing practices who are owned by, or 50 or majority owned by people of colour, because you could have a practice that has a very high percentage of staff who are not white, but if there's, you know, 3 directors who are not diverse or are white, then that also doesn't feel very equitable. I mean, it's better, but it's still an issue that we need to, you know, it's still, as you say, it's still an issue of power.
I mean, it's also not a colour thing as well. You know, you've got to have LGBTQT+, we've got to have the people with different identified isms about them, if that's the correct terminology. And it's to reflect. So we live in me personally, we live in one of the best cities in the whole world. And if you're having a minority of people designing for them, surely, you know, as I said to you, I come from a council estate, and the stairwells, you know, on TV, we get these big American fridges advertised. Now, you can't get them up one of those stairwells because the person who designed it never thought that the person who live in there might like one of these big American fridges. Oh, it could be an English fridge as well.
Not their fridges are available. But I mean, I wonder if, like, what your perspective on that is, Sarah, just coming back to you, because there is, you know, the way that the public sector is trying to address that, but also in your role as someone working for Enfield Council, it's, you know, you're on the ground there, and I wonder, like, we are always talking about working on projects and all across London, and, you know, why is it important that the teams and the people that are, you know, going in and shaping those projects understand where that community is coming from, or like what?
Well, I think actually everything that has been discussed is really, really interesting, and I think it's very relevant to a lot of the conversations we've been having. And I think it's worth saying, I wouldn't say I'm fully public sector, I've only been there a year, but I think public sector is good at putting its hands up and saying, no, we did this wrong, and we're happy to take that on. So we had actually quite a few conversations with Southwark, who were quite open and saying, this is where we went wrong. Some of those problems are the nature of working in such a large bureaucratic organisation. Something might start a few years before it actually comes to, you know, to actually become a reality. And at that point, maybe it's missed the mark, or actually it's just not relevant anymore. But we had a lot of conversations, and I think a lot of the things that have been discussed on, we had this opportunity around when the pandemic started to run a competition, which was an ideas competition for intergenerational homes. Enfield has a huge problem of a large number of sort of 2 to 3 families living in single homes, typically social housing, so over 50%. And that leads to a lot of overcrowding issues, which was amplified obviously in the pandemic, where you have everyone at home. And so it became a really kind of pressing thing at that time, and then working locally, given that a lot of small businesses were going out, weren't sustaining themselves locally. So we had this project, and I think around that time was when Black Lives Matter was happening. And so we had this opportunity to say, what can we actually do? Because I know from my experience and practice, ideas competitions are incredibly exploitative. I also know this experience of having been a tokenistic kind of put her on a bid because it looks good, but I never work on the project. So I came at it from a slightly cynical point of view of what does diversity look like? Why are we asking for diversity? BAME is different to BME, and you know, and I know that, and actually forget the acronyms. It's very difficult to look at these things as like categorizing all ethnic minorities into one group. So let's really try and ask, like, what are we actually talking about here when we say diversity, and why do we think that's important? And I think a big part of that was actually us saying we'd worked in private practice on projects where the briefs were set up really well by the council. They set out the groups of people that we're working with, the groups of people that don't engage with the project, and therefore their lived experience of what it's like to be on a council estate gets ignored. And we'd also had anecdotes of people within the council actually saying they took the design team to the estate. And all of a sudden this like abstract project on a plan that's like meeting minimum London housing design guide standards becomes a different thing when you start realising this is not an ideal world picture. This is not something where you're going to have this lovely family living in this 2-bed house that you're designing. it's just a completely different thing. And so when you put that hat on, you start getting a very different product as an architect, because I think we do get into a bit of a thing where we're like, let's design some housing. We get out the housing design go, we start stacking those in. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. This is a cash-strapped council. I'm not saying we start designing something different. It's just that that needs to be understood as a context of who we're really working with. And it is a challenge. I don't think it's a perfect system, but we did things like asking, what is an SME? So yeah, the definition of that just doesn't make sense, because actually when we talk about small architectural practices, we're talking about less than 10. So we put that as part of our, and actually to be honest, a big part of what we did was, before doing anything, we just started speaking to practices. So we started speaking to Black-led practices, LGBTQIA-led practices, and saying, what are the problems that you face in public procurement? And then what can we do? And we started having those conversations with different councils, because there are councils trying to do interesting things. As I said, it can be a challenge, you know, working in that sort of slightly bureaucratic system. But that's where we started to find a lot of the opportunities about things like recompensing fairly. And for some of the projects like working with Meridian Water, we've started saying, well, hang on, here's a team for X amount of money applying for this project, but they've got 6 people, or 6 different consultants as part of their bid. There's no way they can pay them fairly for this public realm project. So this is not an option. This is not going to work. And let's try and look at, you know, setting some realistic parameters of, we don't want to see X amount of drawings. I mean, for the competition we did, we literally set, you know, we sat down with them in workshops and said, these are kind of drawings we want. We think this is what's worth £5,000. Do not give us more than that. Like, you know, because I think that's the tendency actually, that we feel we have to outcompete the other teams in order to win a project. Yeah. But we wanted to make it really clear, like, this is what we think we can pay you, and we understand that that's not a lot, but then therefore we want this in return, which is what we think is fair. And we tried to do lots of things out there. I mean, you know, there's like a multitude of sort of things we tried to do. And it wasn't perfect, and I think that's what was actually really great, that at the end of that we had to do quite a lot of extensive you know, reflection in terms of Equalities Act, but actually this isn't just about protected characteristics. The intersection of all of this is class. So it was something where we took it to different teams and we said, how do you think we did? And that included non-architectural teams, like speaking to adult health and social care, who were one of our primary sort of stakeholders in this, because they really, you know, they know actually a lot of the communities we're dealing with and what the troubles are of intergenerational communities. So let's not come into this as architects of what do we think are nice intergenerational precedents. Really, what do we need in Enfield? And I think that's I feel like I'm rambling, but it was quite a long process. It wasn't perfect. We're not at the end of it. We're still working with Meridian, with housing, and saying, you know, guys, let's carry this conversation on. What can we do? And they're doing different things. So I think one of the biggest things that has come out is not having these tokenistic small practices alongside the kind of big practices that we always hear about. Having potentially like, oh guys, let's just get the small practice in, put them as part of our bid. Here we've got Black-led practices. Because there is a fundamental power dynamic in that. And so actually starting to give them their own projects. And starting to understand, well, maybe they are struggling to deliver because they may or may not have the CAD programs, or that they need to deliver the work. So maybe they can partner with an organisation, a bigger practice we're already working with, and share resources. So like trying to find ways to do those sort of things where we're really trying to deal with the challenges of what the practices are facing. But it's not a perfect system, and it's definitely a work in progress, and we definitely invite, you know, people, essentially feedback and collaboration. I mean, Project Compass is something we looked at a lot in terms of learning, you know, from experts, in-house experts as well, like procurement consultants. Because really, this is not something where it's we're trying to come at it as like, yeah, this is a X amount of fee, let's get the best thing possible, and then let's tick a box, because that's not what diversity is about, and that's not really what we're trying to get to at the end of the day. And I think that was what was really exciting about the competition, that the architects really did actually respond to a lot of the issues and brought some really innovative solutions forward to a lot of the challenges that we were talking about. And I think that came from a result of doing quite a few different things. But it's not perfect. So, you know, we didn't do so well in terms of LGBTQIA-led practices, and that's something we need to work on. So it's a kind of work in progress, but it's definitely, the intention is there, just sometimes it can be difficult to deliver that. But yeah.
That's really interesting. I think it's makes me think of the point that you mentioned earlier about you know, Marshall Ramrup and kind of quitting just a year into that, and the absolute massive amount of influence and potential that organisations like the RIBA have to try and do these sort of things in a kind of larger scale potentially, but then the way you're describing the process within the council across these other councils is that, you know, it is a little bit, it is top down in that it's organised in that way, but there's so much fine-grained work that has to go into that to make the inroads.
Yeah, and I think there's also, I mean, before I even went to the public sector, some of the projects I was working on with public clients were doing things like making sure that we have work experience students from the borough itself, and making sure we have architectural students from the borough itself that are then part of the practice. And that can actually make a huge difference. I think if I had something like that when I was there, maybe it would have made a huge difference in terms of the confidence I had of actually going to a practice that I really wanted to work with and actually having an opportunity to get my foot in the door.
Right.
But I think actually really what Neil's doing is quite critical, because that's where it starts, that confidence from a young age that someone with your name can actually go into you know, practice. And sorry, so one last thing to say is actually we found after Black Lives Matter, one of the biggest things that we kept hearing was there are not enough good black-led practices, and we started to just, that was actually the first thing we did, we just put together a huge Excel file and realised that there's so many practices working, and that there's a lot of it is about public perception and not taking certain practices seriously. So a big part of that was actually removing the name of practices from procurement documents. So I went around, I mean, I didn't do it in a very clever way because I set it up on Word, but I redacted the name of every practice that applied, and then did blind moderation, because otherwise we come at it with the prejudice, I think, fundamentally, oh, this is a good practice that's done great council housing projects. Let's go with them again. And councils are risk averse. We love stability. So, you know, actually, if we get rid of it, we get results we never expected. And
how can you do that more in like public sector procurement? Like, how can you? I'm looking at you, Russell, because you're always very kind of vocal about this. But you know, how do you do something like that with the, I guess, competition rules and the way that process works?
You can almost do whatever you like.
Yeah.
I mean, it's constantly a frustration of mine that we just adopt the same processes over and over again because they constantly deliver the wrong answers. Yeah, it's familiar, so we just do it. You know, we just do it time and again, and you'd be amazed how much flexibility there is within the procurement rules. As what you can do randomised systems. You can do, you know, you can shortlist practices depending on sort of the threshold. I mean, there's almost unlimited options, but we just don't use them because, as we've heard, the councils just, you know, for very good reasons, are risk averse, but it's the wrong risks they concentrate on.
Well, there's also, I mean, often a lot of projects have pressure on them. There's cash straps. It's we know this works, let's carry on. And that's where I think that kind of, I mean, part of what public practice does is great in terms of encouraging conversations across councils and across these different public sector organisations, because things are possible, and that just needs to be heard and said. Because you don't, I mean, we didn't realise, we were sort of just talking and thinking, well, could we do this? And yeah, you can. If you want to, you can. And that was amazing, because somehow there's a perception of, no, this can't be done. And that needs to be challenged. But I think it is being challenged, but there's definitely a long way to go.
And I suppose you need to put in the time and the work to kind of make something like that happen, because
you're going against the grain.
Exactly.
I think, I mean, public practice has been transformational when it comes to planning as a discipline, and what we really need is public practice to be expanding into other roles, such as procurement. I mean, it'd be fantastic if there were some procurement officers that came in from public practice, you know, who understand these issues, because typically they don't. They don't understand why we want to do things in a slightly different way, and that would be a real innovation.
We've been talking quite a bit about, you know, how these processes of change can work, and we've been seeing them. And Recycle being potentially one of these things that is trying to address that, again, a little bit from a kind of top-down way of doing it. But I wonder if you have come across kind of more bottom-up types of ways to kind of address this issue, where people from the communities that are underrepresented are kind of standing up a bit more to say, look, we're here, like your spreadsheet, like we are here. It's not that
I
we don't
think that
exist.
now we're in an era where we've got a really grassroots level of coming up people, and you've got so many different initiatives, organisations. For example, I like to big up the Poor Collective here, because in the beginning I slaughtered them for the name, but I love them to bits. But you know, you've got organisations like that, and you've got education organisations like Matt and Fiona, Urban Learners, Celebrate Architecture, which I'm part of, and various other organisations like that who are educating young people. And don't forget, we've moved into the digitalised world, so anything you put out there just goes viral within seconds. If it's good, it goes viral. If it's bad, it goes viral. But the young people are on it now, so you know that is where I think the grassroots are beginning to actually spread and take more of the control, as opposed to bottom down. And with Homegrown Plus, for example, we've connected to so many really good architectural practices, and who fund us, who help us, and it's about making these connections, and that's what it's literally about. When you go to places like this and you see an architect, just harangue them. They always talk about resilience. Well, let them be resilient, you know. and this is what you've got to do. You just got to talk with them and just say, look, I'm here, you know, let's get it on and give me a job and give me 6 months, a month, or whatever. And that's how it starts to change. If you rely on just, sitting back and just waiting for it to happen, it doesn't happen. It never happens. You know, I mean, every time an architect hears me, sees my name on their phone, they must think Neil wants money. And I know someone in here knows I want money. Everybody knows I want money. But they're to fund the projects, you know, that we're doing to spread the word that we can, you know, succeed, and we can change the narrative, you know. But don't rely on people just sitting back and changing the narrative for you, because they never will. There's no incentive to them to do it. And even if they try and do it, they do it in their own image.
I mean, I want to bring this back to you, Randy, because it's not, I know hit you on the rebound isn't necessarily architecture capital A related, but you're trying to do a similar thing with that, which is about kind of collectively introducing people into this world that they don't feel comfortable with.
100%. Before I get into that, it's a call to follow up on Neil's point real quick. I think sort of talking on a grassroots level and sort of empowerment of the young people, I think it's also important to speak on the empowerment who the change is affecting the most. So I think you mentioned Poor Collective, and I know there was another collective, Migrants Bureau.
Migrants Bureau.
I'm not sure if we're still practicing, but I think they're just as important ways representing other voices who aren't architecturally trained, but their voice is just as relevant. Because I think definitely there's a collective, as a collective voice, especially when they do public consultations, where they are doing it also on a DIY basis, where the funding required for it is so much smaller and sort of way more thorough than sort of sending a slip for everyone's letterbox and some people whose opinion you want English ain't their first language. There's kind of an awkward thing of you ask them to tick box their opinion on how to develop their area, and they're looking at a piece of paper thinking, what is this? So I think on a grassroots level, it's really important to also talk about how important them practices are, and also encouraging the development of further practices, whether that's through education, through bigger practices, also seeing the value in that and sort of creating, I guess, divisions to sort of work on that, where cool, we may not have a black architect, but the black community's opinion is probably even more valuable than that, but sort of actually asking them what do they want, because me and Neil are both black, but our lived experiences are completely different as well. I see a lot of black people in the audience, and I might think I've got some common ground with you. You might speak and realise that, wow, this kid is a bit weird. It does sort of get like that. So I think I sort of wanted to sort of loop back and before sort of being like on a self-promo situation, really drawing attention to that. To get back to the question asked, sort of in the rebound, I know you mean in terms of drawing people to experience stuff they haven't experienced before. So to give context, Heat in the Rebound isn't a practice, it's kind of an experiment, because I think I'm still kind of figuring out what's going on with it. I was kind of doing stuff for fun, and it's starting to make a bit more sense as we went along. And it started off...
That's beautiful. That is so good. That is so valued.
Thank you, thank you. And it started off whilst I was at university, and one of sort of, I guess, the key projects we've been working on, which sort of is still continuous with me doing some consultancy, is working with Art Fund, and it was talking about sort of the casual visitors, both being people who I guess identify similarly to me, and also students who just weren't engaging with art spaces, and sort of realising that whilst I haven't got a degree and architecture is killing me, I sort of am the expert of my own reality. So actually thinking about, cool, so I understand that I didn't access art space as much as I should have growing up. What barriers do other people face, or I probably face, to sort of encourage people to actively engage with art, and then sort of where that spins off to, whether that's they find a passion in graphic design, they just sort of find a pastime for their own mental health, wherever that goes, I hope it goes as far as I can for them. And sort of understanding that you start applying stuff which was quite familiar to me, so similar to you, Neil, I am also unfortunately a DJ.
Fortunately.
It depends on the day, it can get stressful. And so even using strategies was so familiar of just trying to get to uni and someone just bothering me with a flyer and sort of speaking to me where it's like, that 10-second report as I'm late to my lecture was a meaningful engagement with me. But a lot of the time when we were stopping people and sort of being like, we're going to the Whitworth in Manchester, which is similar to Tate Modern in case someone's not visited, being like, we're going to go walk around some art, do you want to join us? And it's a case of you don't have to know anything about art, don't even have to really enjoy art at all. Like, just come join us, and I guess...
Slag it off.
Yeah. There's nothing better to do on a Sunday. Come join us. And sort of breaking that accessibility barrier by just sort of then being able to now identify someone similar to them to this activity which is so foreign. So many people did come along and sort of created their own relationship with art, whether they came to numerous sessions or whether they then continued to go on to visits that completely nothing to do with me, nothing to do with what we were doing. So I think it's super... Okay, I just realised I kind of forgot the question. What was the question in terms of engagement and experience?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we're talking continuously about like opening access or creating access where there isn't, and creating kind of pathways to something that is other or different.
Yeah.
And just the way that you're talking about doing that with You're on the Rebound feels like
100%, 100%, and I think even sort of our, I guess, paid projects, or I guess privately funded. I'm not too familiar with architecture terms, but I guess private procurement projects, I guess we have to call them, if you're talking like in architectural lingo. Even speaking of that, a lot of the time it's working with people who actually they've got the intention of what they want to do, but haven't got the access to be able to use the right tools, the right convention to sort of convey that.
Yeah.
And sort of by providing that access, by me sort of being me and also my partners being facilitators in the process, it also widens up the access. So I think sometimes whilst it seems access of this massive overarching, like the sky sort of splits in half and diversity sort of beckons upon us, micro interventions is just as powerful, whether that's working with communities who are part of a wider community, and a diverse community, whether that's working on installations with people who've experienced quite unfortunate circumstances, such as homelessness, where you're able to help them create an installation which communicates their thoughts and feelings to people who never actually listen to them. I think the term access is so wide, or there is really no definition, sort of as practitioners, whether that's an experiment at my sake or practice as a 200 people architectural studio. It's sort of understanding that we all got a part to play, and for part to play is so ever changing that they don't ever think, okay, cool, we've done this tick box, because the box doesn't exist yet. So I think that's sort of my answer to the question right there.
Thanks, I like that, and I'm glad you got the plug as well. I mean, I'm curious, I want to open this out to the audience as well for some questions if you guys have questions, but I'm just curious to know, you know, you said earlier, like, architecture is killing me, or this was maybe at a point in Manchester when you were still studying it.
Yeah.
But like, do you have like one piece of advice or for someone looking to come into this world who is, you know, not familiar with it? Like, what would that be through your experience the last?
I'd say always be confident and sort of see the relevance in your lived experiences, that whilst the precedents you're shown on the screen don't relate to you, your precedents from even walking through your own estate growing up are just as relevant, and probably even more relevant in the actual architectural practicing world, because Luc Corbusier is not that relevant in practicing architecture sometimes, to be honest with you. So I think it's really like, I understand the value in your voice, because currently in the industry there is such a scarcity in that voice, that also understanding your value and sort of taking pride in that value, and really using that as your motivation to keep pushing through it even when it does get tough, because whilst it does seem like that you're not being valued, I think when that discovery sort of occurs in the value of these underrepresented voices does sort of switch, it's going to be a lot of fun. So yeah, stay along for the ride. Hopefully you see you there.
I love that. I love that we've gone from like the solution being this like institution-wide thing down to what can you as the individual do to kind of like forge your way through. I'd like to now open up to the audience. If you have any questions for anyone on the panel.
Wait for the mic, please.
Yes, and there's a mic that will come around. Caroline will bring that around.
Go first.
Must be
No,
some.
go around.
Oh.
Okay. I'll pick these up.
Just remember to speak into the mic.
Is that working enough? Yeah. Okay. So we've talked a lot, I mean, I've got loads of questions, but I'm not going to do them. I'll do one, which is, we've talked a lot about procurement and public sector procurement. And that's where my interest is from We Made That. But there's a whole other world over there that's building most of the stuff, if we're being honest, that's outside of public sector control. Do we need laws? Like, how do we rein in all the other stuff that gets built with private sector money and make it do better? What is the way to do that? Do we just hope that they see the light because the public sector leads the way? Or do you have to lay it down more? Because this fine-grained stuff that you're talking about, Zara, I don't see it happening.
Yes, it's quite nuanced. To be honest, I think also partly what you were talking about, I was just thinking about this. I think so many of the things, they are fundamentally, I think, related to the public sector in the sense of actually more about building regulations of what's set really at that kind of level. Because I think one of the things that I realised going through this education was how much of what we design is geared towards, like a 1.8 male able-bodied man, is that's what's setting a lot of our policy up. And the reality is, even if we say let's have more architects in education from different lived experiences, let's have less sort of Eurocentric focus within our academia, which is critical. Let's do all these things. Actually, so many of our projects that are being built are not built even by architects, and that ties back to the point about fees. You know, the value of architects. We're changing. And I wonder if part of that is, I guess, two-pronged of actually maybe there needs to be more focus in university of getting architects into non-architectural roles, actually celebrating that a little bit and saying, let's get them into positions where they have a role in the construction industry that's of, you know, of power, of influence in terms of shaping the spaces that are built, but are not necessarily designing. But then I think a big part of that is actually the policy that is set. And I think we really see that in terms of Grenfell, of what was actually set being something that was, you know, happening all across the UK, in not just council estates, but across all the buildings being constructed. And that starts to feel really critical of, like, who are the voices that are actually behind that process? How, and that's, even to me, is a very mystified thing. You know, we talk a lot about community engagement as part of regeneration projects. Who's being consulted as part of those documents, and what really can we do? And that's where I think is quite important to take this confidence in your lived experience, and to take all these things that we're talking about, and to really start getting to that level even further up, beyond just public procurement for regeneration projects. Because that, to me, feels really critical, because that even just sets what we do, really, you know, into something like the London Housing Design Guide standards. I think MUF Art and Architecture did this really brilliant diagram that showed how a child's Lego kit does not fit into a single bedroom at all if they were to sprawl it out, like, at all. It's, you know, half the size. So who's setting these sort of standards up, and how can we start to get people whose voices could actually be quite important in that sort of situation and be quite critical, and are able to say in that situation, we need to engage and collaborate much more widely, because that's the success of it, like listening firsthand, collaborating. And you know what you were talking about in terms of engagement, is that happening at that level? I think that, for me, that's always been my thing of, like, what's actually setting that bar, because that dictates a lot of what happens in the UK construction industry, beyond just architecture, beyond just even building, you know, right down to engineering, QS, all these other things. So I don't know, I mean, I just sort of feel like,
it's a really interesting point, because there are only so, and I've been thinking about this a lot, there's only so many policy hooks or policy levers you can pull. I mean, our practice does probably half its work in the private sector, and private sector clients tend to employ people like them, and that's where the money's going. And you know, I really can't see that there are fundamental changes that we can make other than perhaps through planning policy. I mean, you could make an argument that there are certain things within planning agreements or the statement of community engagement or section 106 agreement or something that you could start to address this, but I'm really not sure that would have result in a systemic change. I don't know, and that's really problematic, unfortunately. I think if we have any influence, any agency as architects within those decision making, within that decision making, so quite often, well, you know this because we've talked about it a lot, but you know, quite often we get asked to recommend consultants that we want to work with, and we've started to put together an informal framework of non-architectural practices, but companies that are owned by people from diverse backgrounds, and we put them forward for jobs. And so, you know, and you know, it's only a small thing, but it's something that we have agency over. But as far as a sort of legislative solution, I'm really not sure what that might be.
I mean, I guess it probably has to be a multi-pronged approach. Right? Like this, right down to talking to a year 9 student that actually architecture is not building skyscrapers, it's changing the environment around you. And I loved what you said, the expert of your lived reality, and that being critical as an architect, right down to, like, actually who's setting our minimum standards. Because maybe I'm saying this as a slightly cynical person, but those things are often what we fall back on and I think I maybe see it coming from a background that is having grown up outside of London, where actually there's just not that many architects. So a lot of the buildings that are being built, there's not a single architect in the design process. And they are being built for quite often very marginalised, very neglected communities that, you know, to have absolutely no voice in the design process. So, you know, we can't, without saying like I would love to be able to go and say let's have a you know great meaningful co-design process, but how can we actually start to influence those sort of spaces and projects, and I guess that is multi-pronged, but maybe I'm seeing it slightly more from like my planning side of it. But I think, yeah, I loved what you said about that, expose your lived reality, because that really is, like, if we want more diversity, it needs to really start from that very young person having confidence that I can also be an architect, or I can also be someone in the built environment, or I can actually have an influence on the types of spaces, because what I've grown up in is as important as, like, a gorgeous precedent and glossy magazine, which I imagine all of us have at some point felt really alienated by that.
And at the same time, like, even within our own sector, like within architecture, so we're talking about, yes, the private sector and most things that get delivered, and like there's a lot of agency when there's not an architect involved there, but even in our own like experience, we were talking about this, we both went to the same university, and in school, like you don't learn the type of architecture that is about like engaging with communities and why that's important, and like why you might not be the expert of making this really beautiful object, and that's really a focus of a lot of architecture school even now. I teach at Central St. Martin's now, and for the first time I'm like, wow, because we have rules about the way that we kind of feed back to students and the way that we organize our studios and kind of educate, and I often think I wish I had this. Like I wish that there was this kind of considerate, thoughtful process in the way that I was taught, because it was very about the same 5 Swiss guys, and you're like making this really beautiful anal detail of a thing, and it's completely detached to like, who is it for? Like, what is it for? And there's a lot of great practices that are like doing that, and the focus is that, but the vast majority are not, and they, you know, don't have that level of engagement. Maybe.
I just thinking a bit further about this issue of how we might enact change. There is a way, and it involves architects not being architects, and actually the best clients we've had, both in the public and private sector, have been architects, because they understand for all sorts of reasons, and this is where public practice has been great. But also, if we can get more architects into positions where they're commissioning architects, whether that's in the public or private sector, then perhaps that's a way of leveraging some
I
kind of
100% agree with that. I think one of the biggest issues of the public sector is how mystified the application process is. And I mean, I think that partly that's a failure of the universities, because instead of sort of equipping, you know, even things like CV workshops, which I saw you guys had, that's brilliant, but I felt like I left university with very little understanding of how to even put together an architectural job application, let alone any exploration of what goes on beyond that. You know, what are the different, it took a huge amount of research just to figure out like, what else can I do, and thank God for public practice, because they made that a lot easier, because they spoke in a language that was familiar. But you know, public sector application is a real challenge, because it just is a completely different way of doing things. You have to be quite, you know, so I can talk about that at a different time actually, but it's like a very specific way of applying, of demonstrating that you have the experience in order to get the job, because you could be the perfect applicant but you just haven't said it in an explicit way. It's almost like going right back down to personal statements, where you have to write you've done 6 weeks of experience to get a medical, you know, to get in for medicine, which so many people don't know. So it's things like that where it's like, I think there's a huge kind of lack, you know, people are afraid, or people don't, I remember Croydon actually posted some of their jobs in Design Jobs, which is where most of the architects look for work. So we have no idea that there are all these councils looking for architects, or looking for people who have experience of REBA, who have architectural education, but they're just posting it in a completely different pace that nobody realises exists. So I think it's just things like that, where if we could encourage architects to think, well, maybe there's a different career for you that's actually potentially more relevant to your sort of skill set, or maybe more interesting. I think it was definitely a lot more relevant for me to be in the public sector with my interests. And I would just love for that to actually happen right from sort of university, because we might find ourselves in careers that are, you know, just a bit more supportive actually. I love that about the public sector. It's just incredibly diverse. There's just no, it feels very normal for me to be in my skin there. And that sounds like a really small thing to say, but I think it's even just the way people pronounce your name, or like feeling like you don't look like you belong on site, or yeah, I think that's true as a woman. I think that's true if you come from any sort of slightly just not the conventional background. You just don't really feel like you're, and I think that happens over years, and it kind of just like literally switched off as soon as I entered Enfield, because it was just like, okay, this is normal. Like, it's okay for me to be someone of faith. It's okay for me to actually have. I'm fasting today. I'm really sorry about that, guys. I know this is quite normal in private practice, but there was just a significant difference that I felt in terms of being comfortable in my own skin. And so, why not? What's wrong with actually saying architects shouldn't go into architecture? But yeah, so I really agree with that point, actually.
What's amazing is being an educator. When you're in school, you're surrounded, I'm talking in a London school, you're surrounded by diversity full time. Like in our school, we have 2,500 students, 56 dialects being spoken, and everybody mixes together. But when you go to the university process, everybody seems to go into their own little enclave, you know, and this is where I think that all of the ideas that, or preconceived ideas they have of other people, get reaffirmed. And it's to break those sort of barriers down. And like, as you said, when you're in the private sector, they just get reaffirmed because everybody looks like you, talks like you, and these stereotypes are really, enhanced. Where if you're in the the state sector, I call it, not, they everybody accepts people for who they are, their culture, their religion, their ability, their disability, etc., etc., and it's much more tolerant, and it's accepted more. So that's why I think it's you feel more comfortable and at home, because nobody's judging you, and you're just doing your job.
Yeah.
And by the way, I love, and I'm going to nick expert of my own reality. You're going to see some of these little sayings appearing on my LinkedIn. Because, literally, there's so many synergies here, and we must be X number, I won't say how many generations apart, but there's so many synergies that, young people really, really, really do bring out life in you, and they're willing to change. They can change the world. But what happens is we stop them and then we educate them into these pockets at certain ages, and I remember, I'm just going to go off track here. So I remember this guy was doing in my product design class, and I told him to do something, and he said, "You effing dickhead." And I looked at him. I said to him, "Did you call me an effing dickhead?" "No." So I took him to the head of the department. And I said, "This young man just called me an effing dickhead." He said, "No, I didn't. I didn't use the word effing." and kids are so innocent, and they have that natural sort of energy about them. And you could, enhance them, train them, teach them. And this is why, at a certain age, go to university, you want to be an architect, you've got to do this. You want to do this, you want to do that. And also our own culture. I remember telling my dad that I wanted to go to art school. He looked at me like if I was, saying I wanted to, jump off a roof or something. And it was my mum was the one who said it. And even to this day, I have the challenge of explaining to parents from non-traditional backgrounds that architecture and creativity is still a really good profession to go into. And pardon me, a lot of parents want their kids to be doctors, lawyers, it's all of those really sort of, you're going to do the family really good, but an architect is seen as, well, what do they do then, sort of thing. So it's up to us to, yeah.
I'm not gonna lie, I think architect is still, I guess in a traditional African household, to me it was that you become an architect, that's great. You can build a house back home, that's on you.
Yeah.
And it sounds like a joke, but I still need to design a house back home. I'm being So I think even with that, I think that's the most scariest thing about sort of representation architecture being so low that you can come home and say you're going to be an architect, and your parents might be a little bit confused, but once they understand what's going on, it's kind of like
they ask you to build a house,
So you sort of got to question and think if that's still of social acceptance and still being that low. But obviously, there's an issue at hand there, because it's like if I went home and I said to my mum, like, no, this is just spitball examples, no intention meaning this. If I said I want to become like a fashion designer or a chef, I wouldn't be here right now. Like, I might
because
be
creativity is seen as a hobby. It's not seen as necessarily a profession, and that is the sort of thing. Where architecture in England was seen as a sort of a really affluent person's finishing school sort of job. And we had this debate on Clubhouse of why you don't get paid so much money, is because historically architects were basically kept by their families.
It's a hobby.
Yeah, it's a hobby, you know. And that is why the pay most probably is reflected into your hobby, you know. I mean, not your hobby, but I mean, so one of the things that we're doing at Homegrown Plus is, and I've been telling people, tweeting about it and stuff, is we're changing the narrative, and to change the narrative, as I said, we're connected outside of England now, and we're connected to the Pratt's Institute in New York, and this year in July we're aiming to, because there's such a fallout rate of people from non-traditional backgrounds. So the average fallout after part 1 is like 10%, and for non-traditional it's about 17%. So what we want to do is to give them just hope and give them connectivity. So we're and this is where the money comes in again. We're taking 7 to 10 students to New York this summer, and we're doing a program with the Pratts and various architectural practices within inside New York, just to give them an experience, because a lot of traditional kids, they would have gone to New York with their parents at some stage, or they would have gone here, there, never. But when you're non-traditional, you don't tend to get those opportunities. And if we build up that sort of volume of exchange of kids going backwards and forwards, then what happens is, beyond my lifetime maybe, you'll have a grassroots of people, and this is where you work from the bottom up, who would have gone there, come back, and it's called the circular economy of education. So, as I mentioned, my alumni, they all come back into my classroom. Even now, I can ring Joseph and Mark, and I've got another young lady who's doing, I was offered the Grimshaw debate tonight, but I'm here. That is loyalty.
Good choice.
Yeah, and she's talking at Grimshaw, and that's how the circular economy of education, and that's what we've got to build up. People who look like us, talk like us, connect with other people who don't talk like us, who don't look like us, but have the same ethos, values, and that's how we will build up this grassroots. And in generations, it's a slow process because it's been years in the making, so it's never going to be dismantled in one generation. But I think that's what we have to look ahead to forming these layers and hoping that these layers build upon and build upon.
Yeah, I think actually I've really seen that happen with our girls, where it's I mean, that started off partly as a result of me feeling a little bit like I lost my confidence of who I was and not feeling like I belonged, and then actually it's a network that's sort of grown on its own, and people have come back and they talk at their schools, and we've had it where, I mean, it's not just for architecture, it's for anything. We had one of our sort of core team members go back to her school and talk about how, just purely from her own community and her family, she was told as a black woman that she wouldn't be able to study sociology at UCL for whatever reason. This was something they felt, her family in particular felt really strongly, and she went ahead and did it. And the amount of students that she then said came to her after and said at some point they've heard something like that and internalised it, And I think that's the thing, it starts from a very young age, these little voices that
Mhm.
then just go all the way up to like people not ever getting to associate or director, and that's, you know, that really is the problem. It starts from at that point, who tells you that you belong or your voice is important. And this just isn't just about race or one thing, it's an intersection of so many things that might make you feel like your voice is not important in that process as a designer or whatever it is you want to pursue. And it really does make a difference actually seeing someone like you come in and say, this is what I did, this is how I studied it, this is what I've gone on to do with it after. Like so many of the students, so I didn't realise at university what a postgraduate, sorry, not university, but in school, what a postgraduate is. Just really little simple things that might sound really normal, but actually for a lot of students, they don't actually know what that is or what that means or what that could mean. So if you do study English, something that, you know, a lot of maybe parents won't really accept because they're like, what are you going to do with that after? Actually, someone goes in and says, I've done a postgraduate and then I was a civil servant, then I did this and now I'm here. And it's like, well, you would never expect someone who looks like you to be doing that. So it really is actually kind of like a little moment of, and I think we've spoken about just even things like how I've heard it in practice where someone's name is a bit difficult to pronounce, so they're not, oh, we don't really want to consider that. And you know, it's a little thing, but actually that can make a huge difference. I always used to say to myself, that's not important, like, oh, this stuff doesn't bother me, it's fine, this I've heard this all before. But actually it does build up over the years of like the narrative of, you know, you're just not part of the conventional, or you're an exception, and you're lucky to be here. So yeah, and that's really important what Neil, sorry.
That's true. And you were going to say
I think both your points I completely agree with, and I think definitely understanding that, again, bottom up importance is really important. But I think sort of draw back to the question asked, because that was from a private procurement, so it's like then the answer being the appointment of architects within the process. So when you did say that, it sort of did surprise me a bit, because I sort of thought, draw it back and sort of ask what you meant by that, because to me, by the appointment of architects, if it's not a public policy level, how much sort of greater power would it be? And I guess for an architect to have that much power that their voice would be heard, would it not have to be a notable architect? And if that's a notable architect, are we not back again at the same problem of, I guess it would lead to be more architecturally considered, but does that mean it's more, I guess, holistically considered?
I think that the issue is that, particularly in private sector work, like it or not, an awful lot of how that work comes about for architects is through networking.
Yeah.
Right? We have to go out and we have to meet people and take people to dinner and, you know, and all that sort of stuff, because it's within their power to appoint whoever they like. If it's not a public project, it's not public money, it's private money, they can do whatever they like, fundamentally. And so a lot of what we have to do, and lots of architects like us do, is marketing. And, you know, and to be perfectly honest, a lot of the clients that we work for look like us. They like to employ people like us, and it's an entrenched culture, because, you know, we'll do things together. We'll go to events that are not very diverse, because it's self-reinforcing. And, you know, that's the cycle that we have to break somehow. So, you know, and you'd be amazed at how many projects will be appointed just by, I took somebody to lunch and they gave me a big project to design.
Yeah.
And that's all it takes.
But then my question is, how does the appointment of an architect change that? Because I feel like if tomorrow an architect was to be appointed as the director of a pretty expensive private procurement, would that lead to greater diversity, or would that architect now be the most popular architect in London? Because it'd be a case of, you're saying that it's personal relations.
Oh, I see what you mean. So if an architect was appointed as a client,
even as a director or a consultant, surely it'd still have the same effect of, it'd be one of us, but what does us sort of I guess, mean? Because if, for example, a white male architect was appointed as
Yeah.
a director tomorrow,
A director of a practice, you mean?
director of sort of a project, so
Okay,
sort of
okay.
like the procurement process,
Yeah,
sort of
okay.
as a consultant,
Yeah.
a guide, a director,
Yeah.
would it not still be the same effect of personal network, personal bias,
Yeah.
would still go into the decision?
No,
nonetheless?
absolutely it would. And the reason that I'm suggesting that we need more architects as clients, because I hope architects, you know, I'm an optimist. Architects generally are pretty good people, and most of us want to do the right thing. And I think that we this is obviously not the case universally, but what motivates somebody to become an architect generally is clearly not making money, right? Because compared to other professions, it's not very well paid. So there's other things that we want to achieve, and it might be, you know, some grandiose. I want to build a skyscraper. I want to do this. But I think a lot of people actually want to be, you know, get into that position and recognise the challenges that the profession or the industry faces. And what I'm sort of maybe advocating for is if we have more architects who understand the issues around diversity and positions of power.
So that's like architects as
As
developers, architects as...
exactly. Then maybe they have some influence, rather than somebody who's come from you know, a development background, or somebody who's come from you know, a different discipline. I don't know. It's an imperfect solution, but who knows?
I suspect it might have something to do with cancelling MIPIM. One step in the right direction.
Yeah. I think the kind of conversation about continuous, like, creating networks and building those networks, I want to just kind of looking at the time. I want to have time to do that as part of this event as well. We have a kind of bar here, and we'd like everyone to kind of have the opportunity to meet each other and expand your own network. So on that note, I think we're going to kind of close 2 questions, but please feel free to go and ask one of the panelists if you had a burning question still. And I want to say thank you all so much for attending. Like, it's amazing the kind of turnout, especially after years and years of doing things on screen, to see all these people in a room. So it's really great. Thank you.